The tears on Theresa Nelson's face glimmered like silver streaks in the harsh afternoon sun as the townsfolk of Riverside, California gathered around her, their laughter cutting deeper than any knife could. It was the summer of 1876, and in a town where stoicism was valued above all else, public displays of emotion were considered a weakness, especially from a woman who had arrived just 3 months ago with nothing but determination and secrets in her worn leather satchel. "Look at the Eastern lady, crying like a child who lost her candy," sneered Martha Higgins, the milliner's wife whose sharp tongue was feared throughout Riverside. "Perhaps she should return to Philadelphia if she can't handle the realities of life out west." Theresa clutched the crumpled telegram in her trembling hands, the words blurring through her tears. The news of her father's death had arrived without warning, leaving her orphaned and alone in a town where she had yet to make a single friend. At 22, she had come west with dreams of establishing a school, but now those dreams seemed as distant as the Philadelphia home she had left behind. The crowd's mockery grew louder, their faces distorting into masks of cruel amusement as Theresa tried and failed to compose herself on the bench outside the telegraph office. The dusty main street of Riverside stretched before her, the boardwalks crowded with afternoon shoppers who paused to witness her humiliation. "I reckon tears are worth about as much as spit in this drought," called out Jeremiah Baker, the saloon owner whose opinion carried weight in town matters. "Either dry up or do your weeping in private, Miss Nelson." Just as Theresa contemplated fleeing, a tall shadow fell across her tear-stained face. The crowd's laughter faltered as Thomas Kingsley, one of the most respected ranchers in the territory, lowered himself onto the bench beside her. His presence alone commanded attention, his weathered face betraying none of the softness his actions suggested. "Cry as long as you need," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear the gentle rumble of it. In a louder tone meant for the onlookers, he added, "Anybody who's got nothing better to do than mock someone's grief ought to reconsider what kind of person they are becoming." The crowd dispersed almost immediately, murmuring discontentedly as they returned to their business. Thomas Kingsley's reputation as a fair but formidable man preceded him, and few were willing to challenge him openly. Theresa tried to thank him through her tears, but the words caught in her throat. He simply sat beside her, a silent sentinel offering protection when she needed it most. "I apologize," she finally managed, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had long since become sodden. "My father, he's gone. The telegram just arrived." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that framed Riverside's eastern border. "No need to apologize for having a heart, Miss Nelson." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with silver at the temples. "Loss is the one thing every person in this town understands, whether they admit it or not." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside's main street, Theresa felt the weight of the telegram lessen fractionally in her hand. The stranger beside her, this cowboy with kind eyes and a stern mouth, had offered her something precious, dignity in her moment of despair. "I'm Thomas Kingsley," he said simply, replacing his hat, "owner of the Golden Ridge Ranch about 5 miles north of town." "Theresa Nelson," she replied, her voice steadier now, "the new school teacher, or at least I hope to be." Thomas nodded, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The town council mentioned someone was coming to establish a proper school. My sister Martha has been teaching the children in her parlor for years, but she's expecting her 4th child soon." Theresa straightened her back slightly, grateful for the shift to practical matters. "Yes, I arrived in April, but there's been some resistance to allocating funds for a schoolhouse. I've been taking in sewing while I wait for the council's decision." Thomas frowned, the creases around his eyes deepening. That decision should have been made weeks ago. He stood, towering above her with his considerable height. "Miss Nelson, I'd be honored if you'd allow me to escort you home. These vultures might return once I've gone, and no one deserves to grieve under scrutiny." Theresa hesitated only briefly before nodding. Her small rented room above the general store was just down the street, but the thought of walking there alone, possibly facing more ridicule, was unbearable. As they walked slowly along the boardwalk, Thomas kept a respectful distance while remaining close enough to convey protection. The townsfolk who had been laughing minutes before now tipped their hats or nodded solemnly as they passed. "Why did you help me?" Theresa asked quietly as they approached the general store. "You don't know me." Thomas considered her question, his expression thoughtful beneath the brim of his hat. 8 years ago, I lost my wife and son to influenza. I remember sitting on that same bench, telegram in hand, feeling like the world had ended. Not a soul offered comfort. His jaw tightened with the memory. I promised myself I'd never let another person suffer alone if I could help it. Theresa's heart constricted at his words, recognizing the shadow of old grief that passed across his face. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Kingsley." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "And thank you, but it was long ago. Life continues even when we think it cannot." They paused at the entrance to the general store. Theresa turned to face him, composing herself as best she could. "Thank you, Thomas. Your kindness today." She trailed off, unable to adequately express what his simple act of humanity had meant. "The town council meets tomorrow at noon," Thomas said, changing the subject with tactful ease. "I'll be there to support your proposal for the schoolhouse. It's high time Riverside had proper education for its children." Theresa felt the first flicker of hope since the telegram had arrived. "I would appreciate that greatly." As Thomas turned to leave, he paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Miss Nelson, would you allow me to call on you properly once you've had time to process your loss? Perhaps I could show you the better sides of Riverside." The unexpected invitation brought warmth to Theresa's cheeks despite her grief. "I would like that," she said softly. With a tip of his hat, Thomas Kingsley strode back toward the livery stable where his horse waited. Theresa watched him go, the telegram still clutched in her hand but somehow less devastating than before. In this harsh new world where she had felt so alone, a stranger had offered kindness when she needed it most. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Theresa realized that for the first time since arriving in Riverside, she felt something akin to belonging. Tomorrow would bring grief and challenges, but it would also bring Thomas Kingsley to the town council meeting, and that thought provided a strange comfort she hadn't expected to find. The following day dawned bright and mercilessly hot. The June sun beating down on Riverside with an intensity that seemed to press the very air from Theresa's lungs as she made her way to the town hall. Her black morning dress, hastily dyed the night before from her only good blue gown, clung uncomfortably to her skin. But propriety demanded she observe the formal conventions of grief, even in this frontier town. The town hall was actually the back room of Jeremiah Baker's saloon, a fact that had initially shocked Theresa upon her arrival in Riverside. The front of the establishment was carefully closed off during council meetings, though the lingering sense of whiskey and tobacco permeated the wood-paneled room where the town's business was conducted. Theresa arrived early, clutching her carefully prepared presentation on the necessity of a proper schoolhouse. She had spent the morning revising it, grateful for the distraction from thoughts of her father's funeral taking place without her thousands of miles away in Philadelphia. The council members filed in gradually Jeremiah Baker himself, with his waxed mustache and calculating eyes. Dr. Morgan Wilson, whose perpetually harried expression reflected the demands of being the only physician for 20 miles. Ellie Thompson, the banker whose pinched face rarely betrayed emotion. And finally, Mayor Harold Green, whose considerable girth and florid complexion suggested a man who enjoyed the fruits of prosperity. Theresa's heart sank as she noted their expressions when they saw her. Word of her public breakdown had clearly spread, and judgment was written across their features. They saw weakness, not grief, and in the West, weakness was the unforgivable sin. Just as Mayor Green was about to call the meeting to order, the door swung open, and Thomas Kingsley entered, removing his hat as he stepped into the room. The atmosphere shifted immediately, the council members straightening in their chairs as Thomas nodded his greetings. "Mr. Kingsley," Mayor Green said, surprise evident in his voice. "We weren't expecting you today. The matter of water rights isn't until next week's agenda." Thomas took a seat at the back of the room, his steady gaze finding Theresa's for a brief moment before addressing the mayor. "I'm here about the schoolhouse proposal, Harold. Seems to me we've been postponing a decision that should be straightforward." A ripple of discomfort passed through the council. Jeremiah Baker cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Thomas, the funds required for a schoolhouse would necessitate an additional tax on businesses. In these uncertain times, Thomas interrupted firmly, education becomes even more crucial." "My taxes would increase as much as yours, Jeremiah, and I'm willing to pay them." Mayor Green shuffled the papers before him, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Yes, well, we have Miss Nelson here to present her case again today. Though given recent events, perhaps she would prefer to postpone." All eyes turned to Theresa, the implication clear they expected her to be too emotionally fragile to proceed. She felt a flush of anger cut through her grief, straightening her spine as she met the mayor's gaze directly. "Recent events have only strengthened my conviction, Mayor Green," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath her composed exterior. "My father valued education above all else. He was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and his final letter to me expressed pride in my mission here. I can think of no better way to honor his memory than to proceed today." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but a flicker of approval in his eyes gave Theresa the courage to continue. She presented her case methodically, outlining the benefits of formal education, the growing number of children in Riverside as more families settled in the fertile valley, and the practical advantages of a centralized schoolhouse over the current arrangement in Martha Kingsley's parlor. When she finished, a silence fell over the room. Banker Thompson was the first to speak, his thin voice cutting through the stillness. "The financial burden will be partially alleviated," Thomas interjected, standing to address the council. "I'm prepared to donate the lumber from my sawmill and the land at the corner of my southern property, which adjoins the town boundary. It's within walking distance for most children." The council members exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by the offer. Jeremiah Baker stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "That's generous, Thomas, but construction costs would still be significant." "I propose a community effort," Theresa said, seizing the moment. "Many towns have raised schoolhouses through cooperative work. The men provide labor, the women provide meals, and the building rises in a matter of weeks rather than months." Dr. Wilson nodded slowly. "My brother in Sacramento mentioned such an effort in their town. It built more than a schoolhouse, it strengthened the community." Mayor Green looked from Thomas to Theresa, his expression calculating. "And who would teach in this school, Miss Nelson? Your position was always contingent on funding. I would, Theresa replied firmly. I'm qualified and committed to remaining in Riverside. She did not add that her father's death had severed her last tie to Philadelphia. Riverside, for better or worse, was her home now. The debate continued for another hour, with questions about curriculum, attendance, and maintenance costs. Throughout, Thomas remained a steady presence, his occasional comments carrying weight that Theresa's alone might not have. When the vote finally came, it was 3-1 in favor of the schoolhouse, with only banker Thompson dissenting. As the meeting adjourned, Theresa found herself surrounded by council members offering belated condolences for her loss, their earlier judgment seemingly forgotten in light of the decision. When they finally departed, Thomas approached, hat in hand. "That was well done, Miss Nelson," he said, a hint of admiration in his deep voice. "You showed more courage and composure than most men I know." Theresa felt tears threatening again, but this time from relief and a strange, unexpected joy. "I couldn't have done it without your support. Your generosity with the land and lumber. I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary. Education matters, and Riverside has neglected it too long." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I have a selfish motive as well. My sister will be grateful to reclaim her parlor, and my nieces and nephews deserve proper schooling." They walked together into the harsh sunlight of early afternoon, the street busy with the normal activities of a town going about its business. No one paid particular attention to them now, the gossip of yesterday's tears apparently overshadowed by news of the approved schoolhouse. "Miss Nelson," Thomas said as they paused at the corner where their paths would diverge, "I meant what I said yesterday. If you would allow me to call on you, perhaps this Sunday after services." Theresa hesitated, aware of the impropriety of accepting social calls while in mourning. Yet the traditional rules of Philadelphia society seemed distant and hollow here in Riverside, where life moved according to different rhythms. "I would be honored," she said finally. "Though I should warn you, I'm not very good company at present." A small smile softened Thomas's weathered features. "I don't expect you to be, Miss Nelson. Just company is enough." As he tipped his hat and turned toward the livery stable, Theresa watched him go, struck by the strange turns life could take. Yesterday, she had been drowning in grief, publicly humiliated and utterly alone. Today, she had secured approval for her school and accepted a social call from one of the most respected men in the county. Her father would have appreciated the irony, she thought, as she made her way back to her room above the general store. He had always told her that life's most important lessons rarely came from books, and in less than 24 hours, Riverside had taught her more about human nature than all her years in Philadelphia. That evening, as she sat by her small window watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and purple, Theresa allowed herself to weep again for her father. But this time, the tears fell in private, and they were healing tears rather than those of despair. Thomas Kingsley's words echoed in her mind. "Cry as long as you need." She did, until the stars emerged in the clear California sky, and then she dried her eyes and began planning her curriculum for the school that would now, against all odds, become a reality. Sunday arrived with the clarity that only a California summer could provide. The sky an uninterrupted expanse of blue stretching from the mountains to the distant sea. Theresa attended the morning service at Riverside's small white church. Conscious of the glances, directed her way some sympathetic, others still judgmental, despite the town council's approval of her schoolhouse proposal. She had modified her morning dress as best she could, adding a white collar that softened the severity of the black fabric. It was a small concession to the fact that Thomas Kingsley would be calling on her later. Though propriety demanded, she maintained the outward signs of grief. The service itself was brief, Reverend Lawson's sermon focusing appropriately on comfort in times of sorrow. Theresa found herself unexpectedly moved by the familiar biblical passages, which seemed to take on new meaning in her current circumstances. When the congregation rose to sing the final hymn, she noticed Thomas standing several rows ahead, his deep baritone joining the communal voices with surprising musicality. As the service ended and the congregation filed out into the churchyard, Theresa braced herself for the social interactions that would inevitably follow. In Philadelphia, her father's colleagues would have known exactly what to say, offering formal condolences with appropriate gravity. Here in Riverside, she had no such expectations. Miss Nelson, Martha Kingsley approached, her advanced pregnancy making her movements deliberate and careful. She bore a striking resemblance to her brother, with the same direct gaze and strong features, softened by femininity. "I wanted to express my condolences for your loss, and to thank you for your persistence with the schoolhouse. My parlor and my patience have both reached their limits with 20 children underfoot each day." Theresa smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Kingsley. Your brother's support was instrumental in convincing the council." Martha's eyes twinkled with knowing amusement. "Thomas has always been persuasive when he believes in something or someone." She glanced over to where her brother stood conversing with several ranchers. "He mentioned he'd be calling on you today. I'm glad. He's been alone too long." Before Theresa could respond to this unexpectedly forward comment, Martha continued, "Would you join us for dinner next Sunday? My husband and I would love to discuss your plans for the curriculum, and it would give you a chance to see the children you'll be teaching." "I would be delighted," Theresa replied, touched by the invitation. It was the first social overture she had received since arriving in Riverside. Martha squeezed her hand warmly before rejoining her husband and children, leaving Theresa to navigate the rest of the churchyard conversations. Some were awkward, others genuinely compassionate, but all were mercifully brief. As the churchyard emptied, Thomas approached, having changed from his church clothes into more casual attire. Still, he cut an impressive figure in his clean white shirt and dark vest, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Miss Nelson," he greeted her with a small bow. "I hope you're still agreeable to our outing today." "I am," she confirmed, suddenly aware of her racing heart. It was ridiculous to feel nervous. This was merely a neighborly gesture from a man who had shown her kindness in a difficult moment. Yet there was something about Thomas Kingsley that affected her composure in a way she wasn't accustomed to. "I thought we might ride out to see the schoolhouse site," he suggested. "If you're comfortable on horseback, that is." Theresa hesitated. "I haven't ridden since I was a girl, I'm afraid. And I'm not sure it would be appropriate given my—" She gestured to her black dress. Thomas nodded understandingly. "Of course. I've brought the buggy instead, just in case, and we needn't go far if you'd prefer to stay closer to town." The consideration behind his planning touched her. "The buggy would be perfect, and I would very much like to see the site." He offered his arm, and they walked to where his vehicle waited, a well-maintained two-seater with a glossy chestnut mare in the traces. He helped her up with strong, careful hands, then circled around to take his place beside her. As they drove north out of Riverside, the landscape opened up before them, the valley spreading wide with golden fields on either side of the rutted dirt road. The heat was intense, but movement created a breeze that made it bearable, carrying with it the sense of dry grass and distant water. "Your sister invited me to dinner next Sunday," Theresa mentioned as they left the last buildings of town behind. "She seems very kind." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. Martha is the best of us Kingsleys. She's been the heart of this community since she arrived 12 years ago as a new bride. Her husband James is a good man, though quieter than she as most people are. She mentioned you've been alone for some time, Theresa said, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the comment. I apologize, that was forward of me. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, but his expression softened. No need to apologize. It's no secret in a town like Riverside. Yes, it's been 8 years since I lost Caroline and our son David. He was only 4. The simple statement contained words of grief, delivered with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes about the man beside her. Does it ever stop hurting? Theresa asked softly, thinking of her own fresh loss. Thomas was silent for a long moment, guiding the buggy around a particularly deep rut in the road before answering. No, he said finally, but it changes. The grief becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. He glanced at her briefly. Your father, were you close? Very, Theresa replied, her throat tightening at the memory of her father's kind face and perpetually ink-stained fingers. After my mother died when I was 12, it was just the two of us. He encouraged my education when many of his colleagues thought it unnecessary for a girl. When I decided to come west to teach, he supported me even though it meant being separated. He sounds like a remarkable man. He was. Theresa gazed at the mountains that bounded the valley to the east. He never got to see California. He always wanted to. They fell into a comfortable silence as the buggy continued north. After about 20 minutes, Thomas turned onto a smaller track that led toward a grove of oak trees at the edge of a vast expanse of fenced grazing land. This is the southern border of Golden Ridge Ranch, he explained. And this, he pulled the buggy to a stop beside the oak grove, is where I thought the schoolhouse might stand. Theresa stepped down with Thomas's assistance, taking in the location with growing excitement. The site was perfect level ground with natural shade from the ancient oaks, a small creek running nearby, and views of both the mountains and the valley. It was far enough from town to have its own identity, but close enough for children to walk from Riverside. It's wonderful, she breathed, already envisioning the building and the yard where children would play. Truly perfect. Thomas looked pleased with her reaction. I thought so. The creek runs year-round, even in drought years, and the oaks will provide shade for the children during break times. He pointed to a flatter area just beyond the grove. That would be suitable for baseball games. Every proper school needs a baseball diamond. Theresa laughed, delighted by his enthusiasm. I know nothing about baseball, I'm afraid. A serious deficiency in your education, Miss Nelson, Thomas teased, his eyes crinkling at the corners. We'll have to remedy that before you begin teaching the children. The casual "we" sent an unexpected warmth through Theresa, though she knew better than to read too much into it. Thomas Kingsley was simply being kind to a newcomer who had experienced a loss. Nothing more. They walked around the site, discussing dimensions and orientation for the schoolhouse, the conversation flowing easily between them. Thomas was knowledgeable about construction, explaining how the building could be positioned to catch the winter sun while being shaded in summer. You've given this considerable thought, Theresa observed as they returned to the buggy. Thomas nodded, his expression turning more serious. Education matters, especially out here where opportunities are limited. My son would have been 12 now, the age when boys start thinking about their futures. I like to imagine he would have benefited from a proper school. The simple statement held such quiet grief that Theresa instinctively touched his arm, a gesture of understanding between two people acquainted with loss. Thomas looked down at her hand, then met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for understanding without words." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Theresa couldn't quite name. Then Thomas cleared his throat and assisted her back into the buggy. As they drove back toward town, the conversation turned to practical matters: the community building day, supplies needed, and the timeline for construction. It was easier to discuss these things than to acknowledge the connection that seemed to be forming between them, inappropriate as it might be given their respective circumstances. When they reached the general store where Theresa's room was located, the sun was beginning to lower in the western sky, casting golden light across Riverside's dusty Main Street. Thomas helped her down from the buggy, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Thank you for today," Theresa said, suddenly shy despite the hours of easy conversation. It was healing to think about the future rather than the past. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The offer still stands, Miss Nelson. Cry as long as you need, but know that joy returns eventually, even when it seems impossible." "I'm beginning to believe that," she replied softly. He tipped his hat. "Until Sunday dinner at Martha's, then, unless you'd permit me to show you the sawmill before then." The lumber selection for the schoolhouse should be considered carefully. Theresa found herself smiling despite her grief. "That would be educational, Mr. Kingsley. Perhaps Wednesday afternoon. The dressmaker needs me in the mornings. Wednesday it is." He climbed back into his buggy, gathering the reins. "Good evening, Miss Nelson." As Thomas drove away, Theresa stood on the boardwalk, aware of curious glances from passers-by. Let them look, she thought with newfound confidence. Let them whisper about the Eastern lady who cried in public and then spent Sunday afternoon with Thomas Kingsley. Their opinions mattered far less than they had just days ago. Upstairs in her small room, Theresa opened the window wide to catch the evening breeze, then sat at her desk to write in her journal. For the first time since the telegram arrived, she found words flowing easily, not just about her grief but about the schoolhouse, the community that was slowly beginning to accept her, and the quiet rancher whose kindness had started to heal something broken inside her. The summer heat intensified as June gave way to July, the valley shimmering under the relentless California sun. For Theresa, the days fell into a new rhythm: mornings spent at the dressmaker's shop, where she earned modest wages helping with the backlog of summer orders, afternoons dedicated to planning the school curriculum, and evenings often spent in the company of Thomas Kingsley. Their Wednesday visit to the sawmill had stretched into dinner at the small ranch house Thomas occupied alone, a mile from the main operations of Golden Ridge Ranch. The meal was simple. Thomas admitted with charming candor that his cooking skills were limited, but the conversation had lasted until darkness fell, and he had insisted on escorting her back to town by buggy. Sunday dinner at Martha and James Kingsley's sprawling farmhouse had introduced Theresa to the extended family network that formed the backbone of Riverside's social structure. Martha's 4 children, 3 girls and a boy ranging from 3 to 10 years old, had immediately taken to Miss Nelson, pestering her with questions about the new school and what they would learn there. "You've bewitched my children," Martha had observed with amusement as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the children play in the yard. "And my brother too, I think." Theresa had blushed at the implication, but Martha had merely squeezed her hand with understanding. "It's been a long time since I've seen Thomas smile so freely. Whatever happens between you two, I'm grateful for that." Now, as the town prepared for Independence Day celebrations, Theresa found herself caught up in the excitement despite her continued mourning. The schoolhouse raising was scheduled for the Saturday following the 4th of July, and preparations were underway throughout Riverside. Lists of supplies, volunteer assignments, and meal planning occupied much of her time when she wasn't at the dressmaker's shop. "You should wear something besides black to the Independence Day picnic," Ruth Harper, the dressmaker, suggested as they worked side by side on a wedding dress for the banker's daughter. "It's been nearly a month, and frontier mourning isn't as strict as back east." Theresa's hands stilled on the fine fabric. "I'm not sure it would be proper." Ruth, a practical woman in her 50s who had buried 2 husbands during her years on the frontier, shook her head. "Your father wouldn't want you shrouded in black in this heat, especially not at a celebration. Perhaps the navy dress we finished last week, with a black armband if you feel the need to acknowledge your mourning state." The suggestion was tempting. The navy dress was lovely and far more practical for an outdoor summer celebration than her heavy black mourning clothes. "Thomas Kingsley might appreciate seeing you in something besides black as well," Ruth added innocently, her eyes twinkling as she focused on her stitching. Theresa felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Kingsley has been very kind in helping with the schoolhouse plans. That's all." Ruth's knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise, but she didn't press the point. The navy dress would still be respectful while being appropriate for the holiday, and I have a lovely cream-colored shawl that would complement it perfectly. Theresa capitulated, secretly relieved to have an excuse to set aside the suffocating black clothes, if only for a day. Her father, who had always valued practicality over rigid social conventions, would indeed have found the strict mourning traditions excessive in the California heat. The 4th of July dawned clear and hot, with festivities scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock in the town square. Theresa dressed carefully in the navy dress, which featured delicate white piping at the collar and cuffs, patriotic without being ostentatious. She added a simple black armband and pinned her hair in a style that was neat but less severe than her usual arrangement. The town square had been transformed overnight. Bunting in red, white, and blue draped the buildings surrounding the open space, and tables laden with food lined one side. Children darted about, their excitement palpable as they anticipated the games, music, and fireworks promised for later in the day. Theresa made her way through the growing crowd, accepting greetings from parents of her future pupils and townsfolk, who now recognized her as the school teacher rather than the Eastern lady who cried. It was a small but significant change that reflected her gradually growing acceptance in the community. "Miss Nelson." The deep voice behind her sent a flutter through her chest before she turned to face Thomas Kingsley. He was dressed in his Sunday best, the dark suit emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the clean lines of his jaw, freshly shaved for the occasion. "Mr. Kingsley," she greeted him with a smile she couldn't suppress. "Happy Independence Day." His eyes took in her navy dress with evident appreciation. "You look lovely. Blue suits you." The simple compliment pleased her more than it should have. "Thank you. Ruth Harper was quite insistent that I set aside full mourning for today's celebrations." "A wise woman, Ruth," Thomas commented, offering his arm. "Would you do me the honor of accompanying me to hear the mayor's speech? I've secured seats in the shade." Theresa placed her hand on his arm, acutely aware of the strong muscle beneath the fabric of his suit. "That would be lovely. Though I've heard Mayor Green's speaking abilities are somewhat limited." Thomas's laugh was a rich sound that she had come to treasure during their time together. "Limited is generous, but it's tradition, and the speech is mercifully brief most years." They made their way to the chairs arranged before the small platform where Mayor Green would deliver his address. Thomas guided her to 2 seats beneath a large oak tree, positioning her so that she would be fully in the shade as the sun rose higher. As they waited for the ceremony to begin, Theresa noticed the glances directed their way, some curious, others openly speculative. Public appearances together had become more frequent over the past weeks, but this was the first major community event where they were clearly attending as a pair. "People are watching us," she murmured, smoothing her skirt nervously. Thomas followed her gaze, noting the attention with apparent unconcern. "Small towns survive on gossip. Does it bother you?" Theresa considered the question honestly. "Less than it would have a month ago." His hand covered hers briefly, a gesture hidden from the curious onlookers by the folds of her skirt. "Good. Their opinions matter far less than your comfort." The touch, brief as it was, sent warmth coursing through her. These small moments of physical connection had become more frequent between them, a hand at her elbow, fingers brushing as they passed documents back and forth, his palm against the small of her back as he guided her through a doorway. Each instance seemed innocent enough, yet together they were building something that Theresa was increasingly unable to dismiss as mere friendship. Mayor Green's speech was indeed brief, focusing on the town's growth, the promised schoolhouse, and plans for expanding Riverside's influence in the county. When he specifically mentioned "our dedicated new teacher, Miss Nelson," Thomas's pride was evident in his smile. Following the speech came games for the children, a display of horsemanship by some of the local ranchers, and finally, the community picnic. Thomas and Theresa found themselves sharing a blanket with Martha and James Kingsley and their children, the conversation flowing easily among them. "The lumber delivery is confirmed for Thursday," Thomas told James as they enjoyed the feast prepared by Riverside's women. "We'll need extra hands to unload." James nodded, bouncing his youngest daughter on his knee. "I've got 3 men I can spare from the south pasture. And the Wilsons have pledged their older boys." Martha turned to Theresa. "The women are organizing meals for the building day. I've assigned bread and preserves to the Jenkins family, stews to the Bakers and Thompsons, and pies to anyone with fruit trees. What else will we need?" As the practical discussion continued, Theresa was struck by how seamlessly she had been incorporated into this family circle, as if she had always belonged in their midst rather than being a newcomer of barely 3 months. The realization brought unexpected tears to her eyes, which she blinked away quickly, not quickly enough, however. Thomas noticed, his expression immediately concerned. "Theresa, are you all right?" It was the first time he had used her given name outside of private conversation, and the intimacy of it only heightened her emotional response. "Yes," she assured him with a watery smile. "Just grateful for all of this." She gestured to encompass the family, the community, the day itself. Understanding dawned in his eyes, and he squeezed her hand briefly. "As are we." The afternoon progressed with more festivities, including a 3-legged race that Thomas somehow convinced Theresa to enter with him. Their awkward coordination and eventual tumble into the dust left them both laughing helplessly, unconcerned with the spectacle they presented to the amused onlookers. As twilight approached, musicians set up on the platform that had earlier held Mayor Green's podium. The fiddle, guitar, and banjo struck up lively tunes that soon had couples forming sets for dancing in the cleared center of the square. "Would you do me the honor?" Thomas asked, extending his hand to Theresa as the musicians began a waltz. She hesitated, glancing down at her navy dress with its black armband. "I'm still in mourning, technically." A waltz under the stars on Independence Day seems a fitting tribute to a father who encouraged his daughter to seek freedom and fulfillment in the West, Thomas said softly. "But only if you wish it." Put that way, Theresa could hardly refuse. She placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her to the edge of the dancing area, where they joined the other couples circling beneath the early evening sky. Thomas was a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man who spent most of his days on horseback or overseeing ranch operations. He led with confidence, his hand firm at her waist, maintaining a proper distance between them while still creating a sense of intimacy in their movement together. "You dance beautifully," Theresa commented as they turned beneath the paper lanterns that had been strung across the square. "An unexpected talent." Thomas smiled down at her, his eyes reflecting the golden glow of the lanterns. "My mother insisted that all her children learn properly. She held to Eastern standards despite our frontier setting. She sounds remarkable. She was. She would have liked you very much, I think." The simple statement carried a weight that Theresa felt in her heart, an acknowledgement of something growing between them that neither had yet named. They danced until the musicians paused for refreshments, then walked together to the edge of town, where Thomas had arranged to meet Martha and James for the fireworks display. The Kingsley children were visibly tired but determined to stay awake for the promised spectacle, their excitement keeping them alert despite the late hour. As they settled on blankets spread on a gentle rise that offered a perfect view of the display area, Theresa found herself seated beside Thomas, slightly apart from the family group. The first rockets shot into the sky with a whistle and burst into cascades of red and blue stars, drawing gasps from the children and applause from the adults gathered to watch. In the darkness between explosions, Thomas's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with her own in a gesture that could not be mistaken for casual friendliness. Theresa's heart raced, but she didn't pull away, instead allowing herself to accept the comfort and pleasure of the connection. "Theresa," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crowd's reactions to the fireworks. "I know it's too soon with your father's passing so recent, but I want you to know that my intentions, my feelings—" He paused, seemingly struggling to find the right words. She turned to him, his face illuminated momentarily by a burst of golden light above them. "I know," she said simply. "Mine too." The relief and joy that crossed his features made her heart swell. He didn't press for more, didn't try to define what existed between them, merely squeezed her hand gently and returned his gaze to the sky where colors bloomed and faded in quick succession. As the grand finale lit the night with a rapid series of explosions and brilliant colors, Theresa allowed her head to rest lightly against Thomas's shoulder, a public acknowledgement of their changing relationship. In that moment, surrounded by celebration and the family that had so readily welcomed her, she felt her father's loss less keenly than she had since the telegram arrived. He would have approved, she thought, of this man who had shown kindness when she needed it most, who valued education and family, and who waited patiently for grief to run its course before asking for more. Her father had always told her that the measure of a person was not in their words, but in their actions when others were in need. By that measure, Thomas Kingsley was exceptional indeed. The schoolhouse raising on the second Saturday of July united Riverside in a way Theresa had never imagined possible. By sunrise, the oak grove at the southern edge of Golden Ridge Ranch was alive with activity. Wagons arriving laden with tools and supplies, women setting up cooking stations, children darting between adults with excitement at the unusual gathering. Thomas had been on site since before dawn, marking out the foundation and organizing teams of men for different aspects of the construction. When Theresa arrived with Martha and her family, the foundation logs were already being positioned, with more experienced builders directing those with less knowledge. "Miss Nelson," Mayor Green called out as she approached, his normal pomposity somewhat diminished by the hammer in his hand and sawdust on his expensive waistcoat. "Come see your schoolhouse being born." Theresa joined the mayor at the edge of the cleared area, amazed at how quickly the outline of the building was taking shape. "It's wonderful," she said, emotion making her voice slightly unsteady. "I never expected such a turnout." "Thomas Kingsley has a way of motivating people," the mayor replied with a knowing glance. "When he believes in something or someone, others tend to follow his lead." Before Theresa could respond to this not-so-subtle reference to her relationship with Thomas, Martha called her over to the women's area, where tables had been set up for food preparation. "We need you to approve the placement of the windows," Martha explained, linking her arm through Theresa's. "The men will frame them once the walls are up, but the positioning should be your decision." The day progressed with astonishing speed, dozens of hands making light work of what would have taken a professional crew weeks to complete. By noon, the frame of the schoolhouse stood complete, and men were raising the roof beams while others prepared to add the siding. Women kept the workers fed and hydrated in the intense July heat. Children ran errands, and even the elderly contributed by sharpening tools or supervising the youngest members of the community. Thomas found Theresa during the midday meal break, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes bright with satisfaction. "What do you think of your schoolhouse, Miss Nelson?" he asked, accepting a cup of water from her with grateful hands. "It's more than I ever dreamed," she admitted, looking at the structure that would soon be filled with eager young minds. "And it's happening because of you." He shook his head, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Because of us. This town needed someone to believe in the power of education. You provided that belief." The collective effort continued through the afternoon, and as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the schoolhouse stood nearly complete. The walls were up, the roof shingled, the windows and door installed. All that remained was the interior work: the floor, the desks, the blackboard, which would be completed over the coming week by smaller teams of volunteers. As twilight approached, the community gathered around the new building for a small ceremony. Reverend Lawson offered a blessing. Mayor Green made a mercifully brief speech, and then, to Theresa's surprise, Thomas stepped forward. "Miss Nelson came to our community as a stranger just 3 months ago," he began, his deep voice carrying easily to the assembled crowd. "She arrived with a vision of what Riverside could become: a place where education is valued, where children can dream beyond the boundaries of our valley, where knowledge opens doors to possibilities many of us never imagined for ourselves." He turned to Theresa, who stood speechless at this unexpected tribute. "When grief struck, this community failed its first test of character, but today we have begun to make amends. This schoolhouse represents not just our investment in our children's futures, but our commitment to being the kind of community that supports its members in both joy and sorrow." Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small brass key, holding it up for all to see. "The door is fitted with a lock, a necessity even in our relatively peaceful town. Miss Nelson, as our teacher and the heart of this new institution, the first key belongs to you." He crossed to where she stood and placed the key in her palm, closing her fingers gently around it. The simple gesture felt deeply symbolic, a passing of trust and responsibility that moved Theresa profoundly. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Not just for this key, but for believing in me when I was a stranger in your midst. I promise to honor that belief by giving your children the best education I can provide." She turned to address the gathered community. "This schoolhouse belongs to all of us. It represents our collective hope for the future, and I am privileged to be part of that future with you." The simple words seemed to touch something in the assembled townsfolk. A spontaneous round of applause broke out, followed by cheers from the children who would soon be her pupils. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the clearing, and the community celebration continued with music, dancing, and shared food. Unlike the formal Independence Day festivities, this gathering had an intimate, familial quality, the satisfaction of communal achievement binding them together in ways that official holidays could not. Thomas found Theresa later in the evening as she stood slightly apart from the festivities, gazing at the schoolhouse silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "May I join you?" he asked, his voice gentle in the darkness. She turned to him with a smile. "Always." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, shoulders barely touching, before Thomas spoke again. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Nelson." "Another one. The schoolhouse wasn't enough," she teased, though her heart quickened at his serious tone. "The schoolhouse is just the beginning." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Theresa, I know we've known each other only a short time, and I know you're still in mourning, but I find myself unwilling to wait any longer to make my intentions clear." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Thomas, please, let me finish before my courage fails me." He drew a deep breath. "I've come to care for you deeply. Your intelligence, your determination, your gentle heart that feels so deeply, all of these have made me realize what has been missing from my life these past 8 years. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that gleamed in the distant lantern light. "This was my mother's. I'd be honored if you would consider accepting it, and with it, my proposal of marriage." Theresa stared at the simple gold band with its single modest diamond, emotions warring within her. Joy, uncertainty, a lingering sense of grief for her father who would never meet this man who had become so important to her, and beneath it all, a surprising certainty that this was right despite the brevity of their acquaintance. "I know it's soon," Thomas continued when she remained silent. "I don't expect an immediate answer. Take all the time you need to consider." "Yes," Theresa interrupted, the single word escaping before she could overthink it. Thomas stared at her, hope and disbelief mingling in his expression. "Yes, just like that?" Theresa laughed softly. "Not just like that. Yes, because over these weeks you've shown me who you are through your actions, not just your words. Yes, because when I'm with you, I feel both stronger and more tender than I ever have before. Yes, because I think my father would have approved of a man who sat beside his crying daughter and said, 'Cry as long as you need.'" Thomas's face transformed with joy, his usual reserve melting away as he gathered her hands more tightly in his. "Are you certain?" "We could wait until your mourning period is complete if that would feel more proper." Theresa shook her head. "My father valued happiness above propriety. He wouldn't want me to delay joy out of some sense of obligation to convention." She squeezed his hands. "But perhaps a longer engagement." "Until the school year is underway and I've proven myself as a teacher." "Whatever you wish," Thomas agreed immediately. "Though I warn you, Martha will be unbearable once she hears the news. She's been dropping hints about us since your first Sunday dinner." "Your sister is a wise woman," Theresa said with a smile. "And she'll be a wonderful sister to me as well." Thomas carefully slid the ring onto her finger, then raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "May I?" he asked, his gaze dropping to her lips with unmistakable intent. In answer, Theresa stepped closer, tilting her face up to his. Their first kiss was gentle, a tender exploration that quickly deepened as Thomas's arms encircled her waist and her hands found their way to his shoulders. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find love again," he confessed quietly. "Especially not with a crying Eastern lady on a bench outside the telegraph office." Theresa smiled, her heart full to bursting with a happiness she had not imagined possible when she first arrived in Riverside. Sometimes the greatest blessings come in the most unlikely moments. From the clearing behind them, Martha's voice called out, "Thomas, Theresa. The children are asking for a story before we head home." Thomas laughed softly, pressing one more quick kiss to Theresa's lips before stepping back to a more respectable distance. "We're being summoned. Shall we tell them our news?" Theresa nodded, suddenly eager to share their happiness with the family that had so readily embraced her. "Yes, and then perhaps you could help me tell a story. I think between us we could manage something about a crying lady and a kind cowboy." Hand in hand, they walked back toward the lantern light and the community that had become home. The new schoolhouse standing as a symbol of their shared future, a future neither had imagined when their paths first crossed on that fateful afternoon just 1 month before. The weeks that followed the schoolhouse, raising past in a whirlwind of activity for Theresa. August brought the final preparations for the school's opening. Furniture crafted by the town's carpenter was installed. Books ordered from San Francisco arrived by stagecoach, and a curriculum was finalized with input from both Thomas and Martha, who knew the educational needs of Riverside's children better than anyone. News of Theresa and Thomas's engagement spread quickly through the small community, met largely with approval, and only a few raised eyebrows at the relatively brief courtship. Ruth Harper took particular pleasure in being commissioned to create Theresa's wedding dress, scheduled for completion by Christmas when the couple planned to marry. "Winter weddings are good luck," the dressmaker declared as she pinned the pattern for the dress. "And by then, your mourning will be properly concluded, which should satisfy even the most traditional members of our community." Theresa smiled at the older woman who had become something of a surrogate mother to her. "My father would have liked Thomas immediately. He always valued character above all else." Ruth nodded approvingly. "Thomas Kingsley has character in abundance. You've chosen well, my dear." On the first Monday of September, Theresa stood nervously at the door of the schoolhouse, watching as children approached in small groups along the paths that had been worn from town and surrounding farms during the month since the building's completion. The morning was pleasantly cool, hinting at the autumn to come, the sun casting long shadows across the schoolyard where recently installed swings and a baseball diamond awaited the children's energy. Thomas had ridden over at dawn to ensure everything was in order, building a fire in the small stove to take the chill from the classroom, before departing with a kiss for luck and a promise to return at day's end to hear about her first day of teaching. "Good morning, Miss Nelson," called 10-year-old Emma Kingsley as she approached with her younger siblings in tow. Martha's eldest was to be Theresa's student assistant, a responsibility the girl took very seriously. "I brought extra chalk just in case." "Thank you, Emma," Theresa replied, touched by the girl's thoughtfulness. "Would you help the younger children find their seats? We've arranged them by age, with the little ones at the front." As more children arrived, 27 in total, ranging from 5 to 16 years of age, Theresa felt a curious blend of nervousness and absolute certainty. This was what she had come west to do, what her father had encouraged and supported, what Thomas believed she would excel at. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to shape young minds in this growing community. When all the children were seated at the simple but sturdy desks Thomas had supervised the construction of, Theresa rang the brass bell that hung beside the door, its clear tone bringing immediate silence to the chattering classroom. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady with purpose. "Welcome to the first day at Riverside School. I'm Miss Nelson, and I'm honored to be your teacher." The day passed in a blur of introductions, assessments of reading and mathematics levels, establishing classroom rules and beginning the first simple lessons. The diverse ages and abilities of her students presented challenges Theresa had anticipated, but the older children proved eager to help the younger ones, creating a collaborative atmosphere that delighted her. At noon, they ate lunch under the oak trees, the children sharing food and stories with an easy camaraderie that spoke well of the community's existing bonds. Theresa observed with pleasure as Emma organized games for the younger children, demonstrating natural leadership that would serve her well in years to come. The afternoon sessions focused on reading for the younger children, while the older ones tackled more advanced mathematics and history. By the time the final bell rang at 3 o'clock, Theresa was exhausted but exhilarated, certain that despite the challenges ahead, the school would fulfill its promise to the community. As the children dispersed, calling goodbyes and thank yous as they departed, Theresa stood at the schoolhouse door watching them go, a profound sense of accomplishment filling her heart. This was what her father had believed she could achieve, what Thomas had helped make possible, what the community had come together to support. "How was your first day, Miss Nelson?" The familiar, deep voice behind her brought a smile to her lips before she even turned to see Thomas approaching on horseback, his tall figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. "Exhausting. Exhilarating." "Everything I hoped it would be," she replied as he dismounted and secured his horse to the hitching post. Thomas's smile was tender as he climbed the steps to join her at the schoolhouse door. "I never doubted it for a moment. The children have been talking of nothing else for weeks." He peered into the now empty classroom, taking in the chalk-dusted blackboard where Theresa had written the day's lessons, the rows of desks with their inkwells and cubbies, the small library corner with its shelves of books. "You've created something remarkable here." "We've created it," she corrected him, slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. "None of this would exist without you." Thomas shook his head, squeezing her fingers gently. "It might have taken longer, but your determination would have made it happen eventually. I simply helped clear the path." They walked inside, and Theresa showed him the children's first efforts, simple sentences from the younger ones, more complex compositions from the older students, mathematics problems solved with varying degrees of success. "Emma has a gift for numbers," she told him as they examined the girl's neat work. "She completed the advanced problems I'd prepared for later in the week." Thomas nodded, pride evident in his expression. "Martha always said she has a quick mind. James hopes she'll take over the farm accounts when she's older." "She could do far more than that with proper education," Theresa said thoughtfully. "Perhaps college someday. The University of California admits women now." The suggestion might have met with resistance from many men of the era, but Thomas merely considered it seriously. "If that's what she wants and her abilities warrant it, I'd support it. Education shouldn't be limited by gender." This progressive attitude was one of the many things Theresa had come to love about her fiancé. Despite his traditional role as a rancher and his position of authority in the community, Thomas held surprisingly forward-thinking views on many subjects, particularly education. As they prepared to leave, Theresa gathering papers to review at home while Thomas extinguished the stove, a knock at the open door drew their attention. Martha stood there, her youngest child on her hip, smiling at the domestic scene before her. "I thought I might find you both here," she said, entering the schoolhouse with the confidence of someone already familiar with the space. The children couldn't stop talking about their first day when they came home. "Emma is already planning tomorrow's lessons, I believe." Theresa laughed, setting down the papers to embrace her future sister-in-law. "She was a tremendous help today. You've raised a remarkable daughter." "She has excellent examples to follow now," Martha replied warmly, glancing between Theresa and Thomas. "Speaking of which, I came to invite you both to dinner. James has business in Sacramento next week, and we're discussing whether I might accompany him for some shopping. We'd need someone to watch the children for 2 days." Thomas raised an eyebrow at his sister. "And you thought of us?" The confirmed bachelor and the new schoolteacher with 27 students already demanding her attention. Martha's expression was innocently guileless, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Consider it practice. After all, December isn't that far away, and married life brings certain responsibilities." Theresa felt her cheeks warm at the implication, though the thought of children with Thomas was one she had allowed herself to contemplate with increasing frequency as their wedding approached. At 22, she had many childbearing years ahead, and Thomas, at 36, had expressed hope for a second chance at fatherhood. "We'd be happy to help," Theresa said, saving Thomas from having to respond to his sister's teasing. "Though I warn you, the children might be subjected to impromptu geography lessons and penmanship practice." "A risk I'm willing to take," Martha replied with a laugh. "Now come along, both of you. The children are eager to tell their aunt and uncle all about their first day of school." As they rode together toward the Kingsley farm, Thomas on his horse with Theresa seated comfortably before him. Martha, in her small buggy Theresa, reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 months ago, she had been a grieving stranger, mocked for her tears by people who didn't understand her loss. Now she was an engaged woman with a profession, a purpose, and a family that had embraced her as one of their own. "Happy," Thomas murmured close to her ear, his arms secure around her as he guided the horse along the familiar trail. Theresa leaned back slightly against his chest, the solid warmth of him a comfort she had come to treasure. "Very, though I still miss my father." "You always will," Thomas said with the wisdom of one who understood loss intimately. "But he lives on in you in your dedication to education, your courage in coming west alone, your compassion for others. Those parts of him will never die." The simple truth of his words touched her deeply. "Thank you for understanding," she said softly. "Not just today, but that first day when you sat beside me and told me to cry as long as I needed." Thomas pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, a liberty he allowed himself when they were relatively private. "I recognized something in you that day, a strength beneath the tears that reminded me of my own journey through grief. I never expected that moment to lead us here, but I'm grateful every day that it did." The months between September and December passed with a speed that sometimes left Theresa breathless. The school flourished under her guidance, the children making remarkable progress as she adapted Eastern teaching methods to the practical needs of their Western lives. Geography lessons incorporated the trails and mountains they knew, mathematics problems involved cattle counts and crop yields, and history expanded beyond textbooks to include the stories of local settlers, including the Native Americans whose ancestral lands they now occupied. Thomas visited the school regularly, sometimes teaching the older boys about ranching techniques or leading nature expeditions along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse. His involvement extended beyond his connection to Theresa. He genuinely believed in the importance of education and brought practical knowledge that complemented her more academic approach. Their wedding preparations progressed steadily. with Martha taking charge of many details when Theresa's teaching duties left her little time for planning. The ceremony would be held at the church on the Saturday before Christmas, with a celebration afterward at the Golden Ridge Ranch main house, which would become their home once they were married. "The foreman's house has always been too large for just me," Thomas explained as he showed her the improvements being made to the spacious dwelling. "We're adding a study for you, a place where you can prepare lessons and grade papers without distraction." The thoughtfulness of the gesture had brought tears to Theresa's eyes, another instance of Thomas anticipating her needs before she expressed them. Their relationship had deepened over the autumn months, moving beyond the initial attraction to a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. The physical aspect of their relationship remained proper and restrained, limited to brief kisses and the occasional embrace when privacy allowed. Both were conscious of Theresa's position as the school teacher and the example they set for the community, but the underlying tension between them grew as their wedding day approached, a current of anticipation that made even casual touches electric with promise. On the Friday before the wedding, school dismissed early for the Christmas holiday. The children presented Theresa with a handmade quilt, each square contributed by a different family, a tangible representation of how thoroughly she had been accepted into the community. "This is beautiful," she said, emotion making her voice unsteady as she examined the careful stitching and personal touches in each panel. "I'll treasure it always." Emma Kingsley, who had helped organize the gift, beamed with pride. "Mama said you should have something to remind you of your first class, even when we're all grown up." Theresa hugged the girl impulsively. "As if I could ever forget any of you." After the children departed, Theresa remained in the schoolhouse, tidying the space that had become so dear to her over the past months. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Thomas Kingsley, and while her role as teacher wouldn't change, so much else in her life would. The sound of a horse approaching drew her to the window, where she saw Thomas dismounting, his tall figure familiar and beloved against the winter landscape. 3 months of engagement had only deepened her feelings for him, transforming initial attraction into something profound and enduring. He entered the schoolhouse with a light knock, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Your future sister-in-law sent me to rescue you from last-minute preparations," he explained with a smile. "Apparently your presence is required for a final fitting of your dress." Theresa laughed, gathering her things. "Martha has been a force of nature these past weeks. I don't know how she manages 4 children, a farm, and wedding planning with such apparent ease." "She's always been remarkable," Thomas agreed, helping Theresa with her coat. "Though she's particularly invested in this wedding. She's been not so subtly suggesting I find a wife for years." His hands lingered at her shoulders after settling the coat, and Theresa turned within the circle of his arms, looking up into the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" she asked softly. Thomas considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "Not about marrying you," he said finally. "That feels like the most natural thing in the world. But I find myself thinking of Caroline and David more often these past days, not with the old grief, but with a strange sense that I should acknowledge them as I begin this new chapter." Theresa reached up to touch his face gently. "They'll always be part of you, Thomas, part of us. I would never expect otherwise." The understanding in her eyes seemed to release something in him. He drew her closer, his kiss deeper and more urgent than the careful embraces they had shared before. Theresa responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding into his hair as the restraint of recent months gave way to the promise of tomorrow. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "24 more hours," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion and desire. 23 and a half, Theresa corrected with a small smile. "But who's counting?" His laugh was warm against her skin. "We should go before Martha sends a search party. She's determined that I shouldn't see your dress before the ceremony." "She's very traditional about some things," Theresa agreed, reluctantly stepping out of his embrace. They rode together to the Kingsley farm, where Martha was indeed waiting impatiently for the final dress fitting. Thomas was banished from the house while Ruth Harper made last-minute adjustments to the simple but elegant white gown that would become Theresa's wedding dress. "It's perfect," Martha declared as Theresa stood on a small stool while Ruth pinned the hem. "Thomas won't be able to take his eyes off you." Theresa blushed, the intimacy of tomorrow's ceremonies suddenly very real. She and Thomas had discussed having children someday, but the physical aspects of marriage remained largely unspoken between them, a territory they would navigate together when the time came. "Are you nervous, dear?" Ruth asked perceptively as she worked on the dress. "A little," Theresa admitted. "About everything." Both older women exchanged knowing glances. "The wedding night," Martha guessed with gentle directness. Theresa nodded, grateful for the understanding in their expressions. "Is it terrible to discuss such things before I'm married?" "Not at all," Ruth assured her. "Every bride has questions, though few have the courage to ask them." What followed was a frank but tasteful conversation about marital relations, with both women offering practical advice and reassurance that eased many of Theresa's unspoken concerns. By the time the fitting was complete and the dress carefully stored for tomorrow, she felt significantly calmer about all aspects of the impending change in her status. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December sun casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground as Theresa woke in Martha's guest room. The house was already bustling with activity, children being scrubbed and dressed in their best clothes, Martha orchestrating final preparations, James stoking fires throughout the house to ward off the morning chill. Theresa remained in her room, a strange calm settling over her as the hours ticked toward the 2 o'clock ceremony. Her thoughts turned to her father, wishing he could be present to give her away, to see the life she had built in this place so far from their Philadelphia home. "He knows," Martha said softly when Theresa expressed this regret as she helped arrange her hair. "And he would be so proud of the woman you've become." By 1:30, Theresa was fully dressed in her wedding gown, a simple creation of white satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant updo with sprigs of winter berries, an evergreen tucked into the coiled braids, Martha's suggestion for a festive touch appropriate to the season. "You look beautiful," Martha declared, blinking rapidly to dispel the tears that threatened to spoil her own carefully applied cosmetics. "Absolutely perfect." The Kingsley family's wagon had been decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbons for the occasion, and James drove Theresa and Martha to the church, while the children rode in a second wagon with a neighbor. The entire town seemed to be converging on the small white building, dressed in their Sunday best despite the Saturday date. Inside the church, Thomas waited at the altar, his expression a complex mixture of emotions as Theresa entered on James's arm. The congregation rose as the small organ began the wedding march, but Theresa was conscious only of Thomas, tall and handsome in his new black suit, his eyes never leaving her face as she moved toward him. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of familiar words and responses, the couple's voices steady as they exchanged vows before Reverend Lawson and the assembled community. When Thomas slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were warm and sure, his smile intimate despite the public setting. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Lawson declared, his voice carrying to the back of the packed church. "Mr. Kingsley, you may kiss your bride." Thomas's kiss was tender and reverent, appropriate to the setting yet conveying a depth of emotion that made Theresa's heart race. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Kingsley, the applause was thunderous, the children from Theresa's school particularly enthusiastic in their approval. The celebration at Golden Ridge Ranch continued well into the evening, with food, music, and dancing in the spacious main house that Thomas had prepared for the occasion. Every family in Riverside seemed to be present, from Mayor Green to the newest settlers who had arrived just weeks before. As the night progressed and the festivities showed no sign of abating, Thomas found Theresa near the punch bowl, slipping an arm around her waist with the easy familiarity of a husband rather than a courting suitor. "Are you ready to leave?" he asked quietly, his lips close to her ear. "Our house is waiting and these good people can continue celebrating without us." Theresa nodded, a flutter of anticipation and nervousness in her stomach. "Yes, though I should change first. Martha has taken your traveling dress to our home," Thomas informed her with a smile. She thought it might be easier to slip away without the formality of changing here. The thoughtfulness of the gesture was typical of Martha, who had become not just a sister-in-law but a true friend over the past months. Theresa squeezed Thomas's hand in agreement, and they began the process of saying goodnight to their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like the entire population of Riverside. Finally, they stepped out into the cold December night, where Thomas's best horse was saddled and waiting, decorated with small bells that jingled softly in the stillness. He helped Theresa mount, then swung up behind her, his arms encircling her waist as they rode the short distance to what was now their home. The house was warm and welcoming, lamps lit in the windows and a fire burning in the hearth of the main room. Martha had clearly been busy during the ceremony, preparing the space for their arrival with fresh flowers, despite the winter season, and a small table set with wine and food should they be hungry later. Thomas helped Theresa down from the horse, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kingsley," he said softly as he set her down in the entryway. "Home," Theresa repeated, looking around at the space that would now be theirs to share. "It feels right, being here with you." Thomas took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar during their courtship but now carried new meaning. "Would you like a tour, or are you tired from the day's events?" The question was carefully neutral, giving her the option to delay the more intimate aspects of their new relationship if she felt overwhelmed. The consideration behind it only deepened Theresa's certainty about the man she had married. A brief tour, she decided, wanting to see the changes he had made to the house for her arrival. And then perhaps we could continue our celebration more privately. The slight darkening of Thomas's eyes at her words sent a thrill through her, but he maintained his composure as he showed her through the house the expanded kitchen with its new cookstove, the study he had created for her schoolwork, the comfortable parlor where they could receive guests, and finally, the master bedroom with its large four-poster bed and adjoining dressing room. Martha helped with the furnishings, he explained as Theresa took in the feminine touches that softened the previously masculine space. She said a woman needs certain comforts a bachelor wouldn't think to provide. "It's perfect," Theresa assured him, touched by the effort he had put into making the house welcoming for her. All of it. They stood in the center of the bedroom, the moment they had been moving toward for months finally upon them. Thomas reached for her slowly, as if giving her time to step away if she wished. But Theresa moved into his embrace willingly, her arms sliding around his neck as his lips found hers. This kiss was different from those they had shared before, deeper, more purposeful, uninhibited by the constraints of propriety or public setting. Thomas's hands spanned her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss intensified, months of restrained desire finding expression at last. When they finally parted, both breathing more rapidly, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Theresa Kingsley," he said softly, using her new name for the first time. "More than I ever thought possible after Caroline died. You've brought joy back into my life when I believed that part of me was gone forever." Tears pricked at Theresa's eyes at the simple declaration. "And I love you, Thomas, for your kindness, your strength, your belief in me from that first day on the bench outside the telegraph office." She touched his face gently, "For seeing me at my weakest moment and offering comfort without judgment." His smile was tender as he caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "That wasn't weakness, Theresa. It was humanity. And it was the moment I began to fall in love with you, though I didn't recognize it then." As the night deepened around Golden Ridge Ranch, the newlyweds discovered each other fully for the first time, their union sealed with tenderness, passion, and the promise of a future neither had imagined possible 6 months before, when fate brought them together on a sun-baked bench in Riverside, California. 5 years later, June 1881. The schoolhouse stood in the dappled shade of the oak grove, its clapboard sides weathered to a soft silver gray by 5 California summers. The windows were open to catch the early morning breeze, and the sound of children's voices raised in recitation drifted across the schoolyard, where Thomas Kingsley sat on a bench, his 3-year-old son David perched on his knee. "Mama teaching," the boy observed solemnly, his dark curls so like his mother's ruffling in the gentle wind. "Yes, she is," Thomas agreed, bouncing the child gently. "And soon you'll be old enough to join her class." David considered this with the serious expression he often wore, so reminiscent of his father's thoughtful demeanor. "Like Joseph," Thomas smiled at the mention of their older son, now 4.5, who attended the morning sessions for youngest pupils 3 days a week. "Yes, like Joseph. Though you'll have to wait until next year." The sound of the school bell ringing signaled the morning recess, and moments later children spilled from the schoolhouse onto the playground, their energy seemingly boundless after 2 hours of lessons. Joseph Kingsley was one of the first out, his sturdy legs carrying him swiftly to where his father and brother waited. "Papa, did you bring him?" the boy asked eagerly, his blue eyes Theresa's eyes scanning the area behind the bench. Thomas laughed and pointed to where a small pony was tethered at the edge of the schoolyard. "I did. But remember, our agreement rides only after school is finished, and only if Miss Nelson gives her permission." Joseph nodded solemnly, the responsibility of the promise sitting heavily on his young shoulders. "I remember. I'll be good for Mama all day." Theresa appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, her figure still slender despite 2 pregnancies in relatively quick succession. At 27, she had grown into her role as both teacher and rancher's wife, with a grace that continually impressed those who knew her. The school had expanded under her guidance, now employing a second teacher for the older students, while Theresa focused on the younger children and overall administration. She spotted her family and made her way across the schoolyard, pausing to address questions from students and to remind 2 boys that running was for the playground, not the classroom steps. By the time she reached the bench, she was smiling broadly, the happiness in her expression a far cry from the tears that had marked their first meeting. "This is a pleasant surprise," she said, bending to kiss Thomas briefly before gathering David into her arms. "I didn't expect to see my men until dinner." "We have news," Thomas explained, rising to stand beside her. "The water rights issue is resolved, and the railroad has confirmed the spur line to Riverside will be completed by next spring." Theresa's eyes widened. Both issues had been ongoing concerns for the growing community, with Thomas heavily involved in the negotiations as a member of the town council, a position he had reluctantly accepted 2 years prior at Mayor Green's insistence. "That's wonderful news for the town," she said, bouncing David on her hip. "The rail connection will make such a difference for shipping cattle and bringing in supplies." Thomas nodded, his expression satisfied. "It also means our planned expansion of the school can proceed. The town's population will likely double within 2 years once transportation is improved." The prospect both excited and daunted Theresa. The school was already at capacity, with 45 students ranging from 5 to 17. The proposed expansion would add 2 more classrooms and allow for the hiring of a 3rd teacher, but the logistics of managing such growth were considerable. "We'll need to begin construction soon then," she mused, already mentally reorganizing her summer plans. "Before the fall term begins." Thomas smiled at her immediate shift to practical considerations. "The council has already approved the funding. We can break ground next month if you're agreeable." "More than agreeable," Theresa assured him. "It's what we've been working toward for years." The school bell rang again, signaling the end of recess. Joseph sighed dramatically but dutifully lined up with his classmates after a quick hug from his father. Theresa handed David back to Thomas, her fingers lingering on his arm. "Will you stay for lunch?" she asked. "Martha sent extra when she heard you were riding this way." Thomas nodded. "We'll be here. David wants to show you how well he can count now." The boy brightened at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He demonstrated immediately, holding up the appropriate number of fingers with each number. Theresa laughed, dropping a kiss on his forehead. "Excellent. Perhaps you can count the apples in my lunch basket later." As Theresa returned to her students, Thomas sat back on the bench with David, watching his wife move through the world they had built together with a contentment that still sometimes surprised him. The grief that had once defined his existence had not disappeared. He still visited Caroline and his first son's graves on their birthdays and anniversary. But it had been transformed by Theresa's love into something that enhanced rather than diminished his capacity for joy. Their life together had not been without challenges. The first year of marriage had brought adjustments for both of them as they learned to balance Theresa's teaching responsibilities with her new role as Thomas's wife and mistress of Golden Ridge Ranch. The drought of 1878 had threatened the cattle operation, requiring difficult decisions and long hours of work. And Theresa's first pregnancy with Joseph had been complicated, confining her to bed for the final month and forcing temporary closure of the school. But through it all, their partnership had deepened. Each challenge met together with the same determination and mutual support that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. The addition of their sons Joseph Thomas in 1877 and David James in 1878 had completed their family in ways neither had anticipated, bringing a fullness to their lives that sometimes seemed miraculous in its ordinary perfection. At noon, Thomas spread a blanket beneath one of the oak trees, setting out the lunch Martha had provided while David helped by arranging and rearranging the napkins. Joseph joined them when the younger children were dismissed, proudly showing his father the arithmetic problems he had completed that morning. "Very good," Thomas praised, examining the neat figures. Your mother is an excellent teacher. Best teacher ever, Joseph agreed with the absolute certainty of childhood. Everyone says so. Theresa arrived a few minutes later, having settled her students with their own lunches under the supervision of Emma Kingsley. Now 15, and a regular assistant at the school, despite her advancing studies via correspondence with a women's college in Sacramento. Emma is a godsend, Theresa said as she settled on the blanket beside Thomas. I don't know what I'll do when she leaves for university next year. Find another promising student to mentor, Thomas suggested, passing her a sandwich. You have a gift for recognizing potential. Their conversation flowed easily as they ate, covering the day's events, plans for the coming weekend, and news from Martha's latest letter. Her husband James had been elected to the state legislature the previous year, requiring their family to spend part of each year in Sacramento, a development that had initially concerned Martha, but which she had adapted to with her usual practical resilience. As the meal concluded and the boys began an elaborate game involving pine cones and an imaginary fort, Thomas took Theresa's hand, his expression growing more serious. I had another reason for coming today, he admitted. Reverend Lawson received a letter from Philadelphia yesterday. From a Professor Edwards at your father's university. Theresa's breath caught. What did it say? The university is establishing a scholarship in your father's name, the Professor Nelson Memorial Scholarship for Women's Education. Professor Edwards remembered your father mentioning your work establishing a school in California, and they would like to include information about it in the scholarship announcement. Tears welled in Theresa's eyes, not of grief this time, but of profound gratitude. He would have loved that, she said softly. Education for women was so important to him. Thomas squeezed her hand. I thought perhaps we might make a donation to the scholarship fund, in your father's memory and as a way of giving other young women the opportunities you've had. The thoughtfulness of the suggestion touched Theresa deeply. Yes, she agreed immediately. That would be perfect. She gazed at their sons playing beneath the oak trees, at the schoolhouse that had been her first achievement in Riverside, at the community that had become home in ways Philadelphia never had been. None of it would have existed if her father hadn't encouraged her to pursue her dreams in the West, if Thomas hadn't sat beside her on that bench 5 years ago, if the people of Riverside hadn't ultimately embraced the vision of education she had brought with her. Cry as long as you need, Thomas had told her that day, a simple act of kindness to a stranger in distress. Neither of them could have imagined how that moment would transform both their lives, creating a future filled with love, purpose, and a legacy that would extend far beyond the boundaries of Golden Ridge Ranch or even Riverside itself. As the school bell rang again, calling children back to their lessons, Theresa leaned against Thomas's shoulder momentarily, savoring the solid strength of him beside her. I love you, she said simply, for everything you are and everything you've helped me become. Thomas's arm encircled her waist, his kiss light against her temple. And I love you, Theresa Kingsley, for bringing laughter and learning and life back to my world when I thought those days were behind me. They rose together, gathering the remnants of lunch as their sons raced ahead toward the schoolhouse. The afternoon stretched before them, filled with lessons and ranch work, and the 1,000 small tasks that composed their daily lives. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of their days ran the extraordinary current of what they had built together: a marriage, a family, a school, a community improved by their shared vision and mutual support. It had begun with tears on a bench outside the telegraph office, with kindness offered to a stranger in distress. It had grown into a love story that would be told in Riverside for generations to come. The Eastern lady and the rancher who found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most.